Hi everyone, this is Mobsta Lobsta from 300chips.com and welcome to a brief video discussing the problems associated with patching leaks that you can't find or don't know that you're making. The phrase "the evil of inaction" refers to the social concept of not doing anything when you see crime being committed firsthand. Now that's a generalization, of course, but I think the term can be appropriate for use in poker circles too. In a long-term game like poker, oftentimes the mistakes that we don't recognize or that we don't notice can hurt us the most. As poker players, we're constantly trying to assess our strategy and individual decisions. We're always searching for the most profitable paths while reducing our losses. It's much easier to find mistakes and to patch a leak where you've acted in the hand than it is to notice a spot where you missed an opportunity. Thus, you may never recognize the times you're passing on putting money in your own pocket. An action leak is sort of like a garden hose with a small crack. You can see the water pooling around it, can identify the problem, and then go about fixing it. Making a conscious call or a shove can help us debate the decision later on and keeps the situation fresh in our mind for review. It definitely makes a longer lasting imprint than just a missed decision or past opportunity. Think of a wide call you've made in the past. You probably asked yourself at the time if it was worth the risk. Maybe you didn't have enough information on your opponent to call with the hand you held. Maybe the situation you were in didn't really warrant such a risky call. Or maybe the mathematical breakdown of the hand didn't make the call worthwhile in the long run. Whatever the case may be, it was fairly easy for you to spot because you made a conscious decision to push your chips in the pot. The sit-and-go whiz hand here is a good example of an action leak, if of course he'd made the call. Too often, we see opponents that make extremely costly decisions, like calling with the ace-6 offsuit in this example. It's clear that this call would be way too risky, unnecessary, and mathematically very costly. But a diligent player could do a simple review of his session, catch the leak fairly quickly, and make sure not to make the same mistake again. What about spots that we don't notice, though? What about decisions that we might feel are not worth a second look? How do those spots affect us? Take a look at this spot that a student sent in a few days ago. He said that he found himself passing on these spots with a big chip lead. The student said, "My mentality is to question whether or not 300 chips is worth risking here with such a weak hand. I know I can't bust, but is retaining the chip lead more important at this blind level and table situation? I tend to shy away from coin flips when I have a large lead and fold my weaker hands blind versus blind." Now, someone could certainly argue that this example is still an active leak because the student consciously decided to fold the hand rather than missing it completely. However, I argue that these spots are some of the most overlooked and misplayed in the sit-and-go world. Typically, our inaction or failure to notice the situation can come back to haunt us in the long run. Through the years, I've heard many players look at these spots and simply shrug it off, saying 300 chips isn't really worth it at this point, there's no need to gamble. But what they fail to realize are the future ramifications of their decision. By not considering more vantage points, including the mathematical perspective, they limit their ability to make money in the games, whether they believe it or not. They let their perception of the hand take control, rather than approaching it from a more logical thought process. The student's question on the previous slide is completely valid. Actually, I'd be much more concerned if he hadn't thought twice about the decision. Here's a breakdown of what I told him. First, let's consider our opponent. Is he a wide caller? Has he shown signs of being a wide caller? If he's a total random and you have no information, would you still push? When would you adjust to this player? Having information on your opponent will be hugely valuable, and I'm not referring to just a HUD, which can be misleading. Second, let's look from a purely mathematical standpoint. Looking at the graph, we can see that it certainly would be justifiable to shove if our opponent is calling with less than 40% or so. Assuming our opponent isn't a huge fish, or a regular who loves to gamble with wide cards, we could safely push our 8-4 off, knowing we'll gain equity in the long run. Plus, the shove really isn't a coin flip at all. The big blind player isn't guaranteed to win the hand even when he calls. So, you're going to pick up the chips every time he folds, which will be the majority, and you're going to win a decent amount of the time when he does call. In lessons, we discuss this concept in more depth, but it's worth noting in a pretty simplistic form here. Third, Think about the sit-and-go's future. This last component is the most difficult to consider and is almost always overlooked regardless of ability level. I think most players avoid the theoretical aspect of a sit-and-go, either because they don't think it's necessary, or they've just never had it mentioned to them in the past. The thing is, the theoretical perspectives can really increase your long-term edge. Most players have some knowledge about their opponents and occasionally address the math issue, but they don't often consider the future scenarios likely in the sit-and-go. In supers and hypers, the blinds move up fast. So, just because you have a chip lead now, that doesn't guarantee anything down the road. We're not in the money yet, and we're almost certain to have to play some more hands before we get there. Likewise, if you had a short stack on the bubble, you might not be as desperate as you think because of the actions and responses of your opponents. That's for another time, though. If we can anticipate our opponent's actions now and their thought process, we can find the optimal decision for our hand. For the earlier example with 8-4 off, these are some questions I quickly ask myself. Is the big blind player going to call with 40%? If the blinds go up next hand, are the players left going to significantly widen their ranges? Are they playing scared, or do they seem to just want to cash? By passing on this shove, will I take advantage of a better opportunity later? Most of the time, the answers and your responses to them will be fairly obvious. And sometimes they won't. But actively engaging in your decision-making process should clarify many of your plays. Plus, it'll help keep you focused and help you adjust should the need arise. This is just one example of a future scenario, but I think the majority of sit-and-go players don't consider it. Say we're thinking about the 8-4 offsuit blind versus blind shove. Pre-flop, we're holding about 43.77% equity. If we shove, we'll have a 3150 chip stack and 45.92% equity in the sit-and-go, assuming the big blind player folds. If we fold, though, we'll have 2850 in chips and 42.68% equity. That might not seem like too big of a deal, but by folding, the small blind player has 1400 chips instead of the 1100 he would normally have. Now let's say we have Queen-Jack suited next hand and decide to shove from our button. Assume the small blind player calls with 7-7 and we don't suck out. Now we're holding 1450 in our stack, which is good for 26.38% equity. That's a significant drop from the 43.77% we had last hand. But hey, beats happen and we run into cards, and that'll forever be a part of poker. But wait, what if you'd shoved the 8-4 off when you had the chance? Assuming you still run into the 7-7 and lose, you'd now have 2050 chips in your stack, good for 33.88% equity. That's a 600 chip difference and a 7.5% equity boost that you wouldn't have had normally. What might appear as not worth it could actually be incredibly valuable when you consider the future consequences. Obviously, this hand with 8-4 off is just one example, but the variations are endless. Our inaction caused us to lose in a couple of ways, not just the 100 chips blind versus blind. What most players don't realize is that these situations add up over time and can cost huge amounts of profit. Do you ever wonder why some players' stats and graphs look consistent and clean, while others go through 20,000 game break-even or losing stretches? They might try to blame it all on bad luck or variance, but the mistakes they don't notice might be costing them everything. Inactive leaks like this cost players thousands of dollars every year, but the emotional toll could actually be much worse than the financial. Good players are always searching for things they actively do wrong, but could still be missing many spots that are even more important. I hope this video shed some light on your thought process and that you'll begin to think outside of the traditional poker box. Some of your biggest leaks might be things that you haven't even noticed yet, so it might be time to go back and take a hard look at your strategy. Don't fall prey to the evil of inaction. As always, I'd be happy to review any hand histories you have and give my full analysis and thought process. You can also view all of our videos in the 300chips.com library and get a new perspective on the games. Send me a message using the Contact Us tab at the top of the page, and I'll get back to you right away. For 300chips.com, this is Mobsta Lobsta. Thanks for watching.